the political affiliation between the ANC, Cosatu, and the South African Communist Party. It is especially relevant in the year the ANC celebrates its 100-year anniversary, amidst ongoing debates about the state of our new democracy and the future of the party. Webster has gone from being arrested in 1975 for, quote, prompting worker unrest, to being recognized with the prestigious Aya Bahat Visiting Professorship for Development and Decent Work at Castle University in 2009. He has worked at different levels of the labor movement and has made invaluable contributions to this movement throughout his career. From the new beginnings of the labor movement in 1973 to the founding of Cosatu, Natu, Fedusa, his life's work is also a history of the working class movement in our country. In his 33 years at the University of the Witwatersrand, Professor Webster served as the head of the sociology department and dedicated his work to researching and finding answers he has dedicated his life's work to, quote, researching and finding answers to national and international labor questions, end quote. Webster has been credited with transforming the study of labor internationally and growing the field as an important area in the academy. Webster's research has focused on theories of democratic transition, changing workplace representation, and its relationship to economic performance, and the changing role of labor during the consolidation of democracy in South Africa. He was the founder and director of Society Work and Development Institute and has authored or co-authored 6 books, 32 chapters in books, 34 refereed articles, 32 research reports, 35 book reviews, and 29 published articles in popular media and counting. We are honored to host him. The format of this evening is Professor Webster will talk for about 35 minutes. Then we'll open the floor for questions. For time, we ask that everyone limits to 1 or 2 questions, and if we have more time, we'll come around for more questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much for this opportunity to share ideas with you this evening. And I wanted first to ask you a question. If you lose your way in the forest or in the mountains, what do you have to do? Comrade, I didn't hear you. What would you do if you lose your way?
Find a way to find it.
Huh? Yes, what do you do if you lose your way? What do you have to do?
Find a way to find it.
But you've lost your way. I was taught that if you lose your way, you've got to retrace your steps, right? You've got to go back to where you started, from what you remember. And that's what I want to do with you this evening. I want to take you back to where a movement started. And I want to take you back because I think we've lost our way. And when you lose your way, you've got to go back and look at where you've come from. And I want to, in taking you back in time, I want to look at it from another place. I want to look at it, I want to start in Durban in the 1970s, the height of apartheid. The English historian E.H. Carr used to say, what you see depends on which side of the mountain you stand. So I want you to stand and look at the rise of the workers' movement in Durban in the 1970s. And I want to begin with a survey I did, a questionnaire. And I asked workers, black workers, in 1975, who do you think is a leader in the present or the past of African workers? Okay? Now, who do you think they said? 1973, 1975.
Moses Mabhida.
Moses Mabhida, okay. That's interesting. Of course, there now is a stadium named after him. Who else? A leader, past or present, of African workers. I think you're stealing a bit my thunder here. Buthelezi, okay.
Don't say anymore.
Okay, Gachi Buthelezi. I mean, who's the sort of most popular figure in South Africa, politically? Nelson Mandela. Okay. Oh, is it obvious? Mandela, okay. Past or present? Huh? No, he didn't come up. Interesting. Tama, no, he didn't come up. No, Solly Sachs didn't come up. A leader, past or present? Luthuli. Albert Luthuli. Albert Luthuli. This is how, and this is the order that it came in. Albert Luthuli was overwhelmingly the highest. Then came Gachi Buthelezi. And then came Mandela. And then Moses Mabhida. And when I presented these results to my colleagues, fellow white intellectuals like me, one of them, who subsequently became a minister, Alec Irwin, do you know the name? He said to me, who is Moses Mabhida? Okay, now this is 40 years ago. I said, I don't know who Moses Mabhida is. What I do know is that this man who did the survey, he would have been objective. And if this is what the workers said, I believe him. Of course, and this was the lesson for me, that these workers were struggling. They weren't just blank checks. They had a history of their own. They had struggles of their own. They had their own political traditions. They weren't just a blank check, and they were deeply rooted in Durban at the time, early 1970s. Now, I want to put a question to you in this lecture, which I want to try and answer. What happened in 1973? There were strikes, mass strikes for the first time after a period when the ANC had been banned and the other political movements. And these strikes led to the emergence of black trade unions. Trade unions for black workers re-emerged at the height of apartheid. But they also, at the same time, there is, of course, a history of trade unionism that goes back to after the First World War in South Africa for black workers. And there was a tradition, and the tradition was linked to the African National Congress. what was called the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACP. So you had, if you like, a history of struggle through the ANC and through SACP that goes back many decades, and then you have a new movement that emerged, a new movement that had a different kind of organization that emerged in the wake of the strikes of 1973. And the question I'm posing to you, and I want you to think it through with me, is there one continuous tradition in South Africa, what I've called a seamless web, or did we see emerging in the 1970s a new kind of labor movement, a new kind of labor movement? And that's the question I'm posing here. I've called it seamless web or democratic rupture. Is there something fundamentally new that emerged? And what I want to begin with is to take two different perspectives. And I want to draw from, I don't know whether, Zaki, you have the South African Democratic Trust, Road to Democracy in South Africa. You don't have it here. There are two interpretations. There's the one interpretation that says that this movement grew from the exile, from the ANC, and then there's an alternative interpretation by David Hempson and Martin Lagassick and others that argues that these unions emerged because of a focus on the day-to-day problems that workers faced. So you've got these two, let's say, narratives about the relationship between trade unions and the ANC. And I want to present to you three propositions, about three arguments about this. And I'd like to begin by showing how these movements first emerged. I think there were two things that happened that allowed these organizations to emerge. The first one is that you had a group of, let's call them intellectuals. Now, when you think of intellectuals, what do you think of? What do you think an intellectual is? How would you define an intellectual? What do you understand by that word, intellectual? Intellectual. Who's an intellectual? Me, an intellectual. Why? Why am I intellectual?
Because you have an understanding in certain, you know a lot about sociology or about history.
So, for your idea of an intellectual is somebody who has been to university and has ideas, and is that what you think?
No.
Not?
Someone who has been to university in society, it's obvious that that person is an intellectual, but someone who also has an understanding of something, maybe the history of the history who has never been to university, that person would be regarded as an intellectual.
Is there? How would you define that? What is there a particular term you would use for that? What kind of intellectual is that? Organic, that's it. I think we should give her a big hand here. That's a wonderful. Okay. if I could, I think the organic intellectual, I need to, there are different kinds of intellectuals. I think an organic intellectual, you are organic intellectuals. And the person who developed this idea, does anyone know who first used that term? These guys are cheating in the front row here. Gramsci here. There's the organic, you should note this here because it describes so many organic intellectuals. And by organic intellectuals, he meant people who are in the working class, who didn't necessarily study at university, but had ideas. And he says, anyone, he says, we are all intellectuals. That's what makes us human. That's what distinguishes us from a horse or a cow. We can think. So we're all intellectuals. Antonia Gramsci said, we're all intellectuals, and these are intellectuals of the working class. There are different kinds of intellectuals. And these intellectuals, I would suggest, were crucial in developing the workers' movement. But they're not the organic intellectuals. And then you have the term I would use would be freelance. I'd classify myself as a freelance intellectual. I'm not working for anyone in particular, right? That's a sort of free-floating intellectual. And then you may have a more sort of professional type of intellectual. And that would be the lawyers, that you need the lawyers in the labor movement, or economists. So you had coming together in Durban in the 1970s, intellectuals, organic intellectuals, workers who began to think of how one could actually organize workers. You had lawyers who came to work with the labor movement. You had what I would call party intellectuals. Party intellectuals, in other words, intellectuals that are in the party. Now, there was one who worked with us who subsequently became very famous. And I'll give you the clue. He has many wives. Jacob Zuma, yeah, you got it. Jacob Zuma, you've got it now. It's not the only thing he's done in life. He has also done other things. He came off Robben Island in 1972, right? And at the time, the ANC was banned, the Communist Party was banned, but he was also part of it, but he's a different kind of intellectual, in the sense that he was an intellectual of the...
Peasantry.
Of the peasantry. Well, of the party, really. I'm calling it party intellectuals. And what you have... So, I think the first thing that brought this movement together was the idea of intellectuals bringing ideas of that workers could begin to understand their experiences and why it was necessary for them to come together collectively. Because the idea of the trade union is an injury to one is a into all. It's collective. You stand together. You stand together. If you stand together, then you have collective strength and you're much stronger than when you're on your own. And what had happened in Durban is workers had simply, all they'd done is stopped work, folded their arms, and said, "High corner, no more work," right? And if you do that, if you hold back your labor, you go out on strike, that's your weapon. It's not a gun, it's actually a peaceful weapon. You stop work, you do it in a disciplined way. That's important because you've got to stand together. And you've got to have solidarity, collective solidarity. So the idea was if workers came together and they acted and they built organizations, they could actually challenge the apartheid system from within, inside the factories, in the workplace. But in order to understand that, intellectuals brought ideas about how the economy works, about how society works, how the laws work. So when we started off then, it was quite simple, really. You had factory workers who'd never used a telephone. So we'd have little exercises in the office to explain how and play out the role. You the union organizer, you trying to get the union recognized, and you've got to speak to the boss. What do you say to the boss? Okay, so you're building up organization. And there are three principles that were central to that organization, and I'm going to come back to because they're quite fundamental. The first principle is that you elect your representatives, and those representatives have a mandate, okay? They're not just there to do what they want to do. They are there with a mandate to carry out what the wishes of the workers are, okay? So that's the first idea. The second one is that they are accountable. That is that they are elected by the workers, and they are responsible to those workers. And then the third idea was workers' control, that the workers would actually control those unions. So you'd build up your strength at the base. At the base. This is the sort of central idea that intellectuals pushed forward, that there's a need to build up strong cadre of leaders who would win. It wouldn't be like smash the state and overthrow the state. No. It was much more, the word incremental, step by step, all right? Step by step. So if a worker is dismissed because he came late for work, and the white supervisor says, "You're out," okay? You don't, as an individual, try and attack that supervisor. What you do is you get together with your fellow workers and you stop work, and you make a demand, and you say, "We're not going to work until you reinstate that man." So what you're doing then is you're building up democracy from below, making your leaders accountable to the members, but you're demonstrating to them that they have power. That's what you're doing. You're putting power in their hands. But it's power that's being used in a very disciplined way, because your strength lies in your collective solidarity. But what you're demonstrating to the workers is that if you take an issue up that is directly related to the worker's experience, like a dismissal, like a racial abuse, or a wage demand, then you're going to build up step by step a movement. And that's really how the organization began to emerge in Durban. But it's not just intellectuals. You can't do this simply through activism. The reason why workers responded to these demands was because the intellectuals were stepping and activists were tapping into their lived experiences, their own experiences. It wasn't something from outside, it was something that was part of the experiences. And if you could go back and think about the 1970s and what was happening and the experiences, one of the first things that struck me, every meeting would open with a prayer. Now, let's see, this is something unusual. But of course, what they said in the prayer was Mlungu and so on and so forth, you know, saying all sorts of things. Basically, the point is that to get through to those workers, you had to speak their language and their experience. And at the time, of course, you also had the black consciousness movement. Living in Durban at the time was Steve Biko. And Steve Biko had said, look, black people must come together, common experiences. And he emphasized the importance of black people having a sense of their own dignity. Black is beautiful, black has its own history, building up the confidence. So there were other experiences. There were the struggles in the schools at the time by students against Bantu education. And there's also things in African society that the unions drew on, like Stokvels, where they would actually come together and share their rotating credit. And also a tradition that when you make decisions that everyone is included in it. So you have this tradition of building up a grassroots movement. But of course, that's only half of the story. At the same time, you had that other tradition, the ANC tradition. And the ANC tradition, of course, at the time was in exile and was following a different strategy. It was following a strategy of armed struggle, of Mkhonto weSizwe. Now, that was a difficult situation. And there was quite a lot of tension. Don't forget, now Jacob Zuma is underground, reporting to the ANC. The trade unions are above ground and are trying to negotiate in the factories. So their strategy at the time was to try and recruit activists into Mkhonto weSizwe. And in fact, the one who was most effective was Harry Gwala, who became a leading figure. So there was you had, on the one hand, you had a movement that was emphasizing participatory democracy, accountability on the shop floor, recall of your leaders. And then you had a political movement that was designed to smash the apartheid state. So there was those two, and the trade unions, as they grew in the 70s, they survived. The law was changed to recognize black unions. They became more and more powerful, and they became a central force. And Cosatu, the Congress of African Trade Unions, was formed in 1985, grew out of that tradition. But it was a compromise, because the first thing that Cosatu did when it was formed in Durban in 1985 was to go, the leadership, the Secretary General, of Cosatu was Jay Naidu. Jay Naidu, the first thing they do is went to Lusaka and they spoke to the ANC, and that was the basis of the alliance between ANC and Cosatu, but it was never a comfortable alliance. It was never a comfortable alliance because the trade unions had developed their own leaders. They developed their own political culture. And most importantly, they developed their own finances. Because when you get recognition in the shop floor from management, the first thing you do is an agreement whereby the company takes off a certain amount of money every month off your salary for being a member. So the union had money of its own. And when the ANC came back to South Africa in 1990 and it was banned from exile, Cosatu was a very powerful force, an independent force. And that, I think, has opened up a sort of tension between the ANC and the trade union movement. And it's something I think we see today, ongoing tension between the Cosatu that is responding to workers' interests that are to do with day-to-day issues, wages, working conditions, maybe talking socialism as a long-term goal, and the ANC governing the country in a globalized world where the pressure is on governments to encourage investment by foreign companies. I always recall when Nelson Mandela came out of prison in, was it February 1990, and spoke here in Caledon Square and said the ANC is committed to nationalization. That's the Freedom Charter. I think it was 2 years later, after he'd been to the World Economic Forum, and he dropped the N word and he replaced it with the P word. What's the P word? Privatization. And that, I think, is the pressures, and that sort of opened up the tension, but it's a tension where there hasn't been a divorce, where there's tension between the ANC and Cosatu, because Cosatu is an independent organization with its own program. And next Friday we'll see that acted out again in the strike in Gauteng, where Cosatu's challenging the e-toll and the government is trying to maintain its new public transport system and get the money back. So just if I could then just to conclude I think what I'm suggesting to you is that there was a moment in the 1970s when an alternative tradition was emerging in Durban. It was a new generation of young activists like you, committed to building up a democratic movement from below, emphasizing participation, accountability, mandating. But that sort of embryo, if you know that word embryo, the beginning of something. Embryo, what's another word for an embryo? A seed. That sort of seed of a movement that was democratic, shop floor based, it was overtaken by broader political and national events. And although that tradition continues in the labor movement, it didn't break through and achieve that idea of a participatory democracy. And at the center of that idea was, and I want to end on this, but I want to write it down. There was an argument that you need to think of utopia. Now, what does utopia mean? What does it mean? Utopia. Huh?
Utopia, it's a beautiful place with peace, with nothing else. It's where everyone gets everything that you want, which it's a lovely place where there's no distraction.
It's interesting. I mean, you're right at one level. I have to use this, do I? It's like many words in English.
Yes.
It comes from the Greek word. And topia is place. And you is nowhere. It's no place. That's what it means. Utopia is something in your head. It's this vision of an alternative society where there'd be equality, where there would be harmony, redistribution, democracy. But the argument is that if you want to build something different, okay, you have to think in utopian terms. You've got to think of an alternative that doesn't exist. And the person who developed those ideas, and I want to end with that, was a fellow intellectual called Richard Turner, who wrote this book called The Eye of the Needle. Now, you know that biblical phrase, the eye of the needle? The eye of the needle? I mean, you guys are sort of well trained in biblical.
It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than for a wealthy man to enter the kingdom of God.
You got it. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. So what Turner was arguing for that in 1972 was the idea that we could actually build a utopia. And his first chapter was called The Necessity of Utopian Thinking. The necessity of utopian thinking. And I want to leave you with that idea that if you want to change the world, you actually have to think first of how it could be different. You've got to think of what a different world would look like. And once you've got that vision of a different world, then you mobilize people around that. But the point I would want to emphasize is that this early workers' movement, and I would say that tradition of shop floor democratic unionism continues inside Cosatu, but it may not be the dominant form in Cosatu, because I think things have happened, new men of power. People get wealthy, they start taking on tenders, and so on and so forth. But there is a tradition there, the tradition that I'm wanting to share with you this evening is that tradition of building democracy from below at the grassroots. But it's something that takes a long period of time. It's a step-by-step one, and the key point about it is, I think, is that you have to build up support by showing that you can win gains, incremental, step by step, and in that way you build up an organization. And that started very, very modestly. And I must say, Richard Turner was assassinated on the 8th of January 1978. And it's interesting, why kill an intellectual? And you kill the intellectual because the power of ideas. Thank you.
Any questions?
What does the professor mean when he says we must have an idea or ideas that are in a way utopian? If this place is a place that is no way and cannot be achieved, would he disagree when I say that at least those ideas must be workable, or something that can be achieved and that are in some ways realistic?
Shall I take question? I think that's an excellent question. And let me put it this way. There are some things that are not possible. Like, it's not possible to turn a lion into a vegetarian. How's that? It's not possible to turn a lion into a vegetarian. They're meat eaters. So there are some things that are not possible, but
I think you can turn a lion into a vegetarian quicker than you can turn most African men into vegetarians.
okay, I'll bow to your superior knowledge there. But there are other things, for example, that if I said in 1973 that we're going to have a black president in South Africa, people have said, you are? Mad. You're mad. Do you know what I mean? So I want you to think, what I'm saying to you is, and the word that people have used is real utopia. It sounds, what we say in English, an oxymoron. It sounds like a nonsense statement, because you're saying utopia, which is nowhere, real, which is something concrete. But what you're saying too is exactly that. If you want to change the world, you have to have some idea of how it could be different. That's the thinking, okay? But those ideas have to be realistic. They have to be feasible. So when you say utopia, I say real utopias. I say you have to think about a different world, but you must think of strategies that are feasible and realistic. That's why I said that the strategies we used in the 1970s, we had a long-term vision. Okay, well, it was a vision of a participatory democratic society, maybe broadly a socialist society. But to get that goal, you have to go step by step. Step by step. Step by step. There's a famous story that Oliver Tambo tells, and it's in Luli Kalinikos's book on Beyond the Elingeni Mountains, where Oliver Tambo was organizing activists like you in the 1950s in Johannesburg. When he was...
You're not being filmed.
When he,
just sit over there.
okay.
Or stand over there.
Okay. When he was faced by workers who were wanting to go out on strike, okay? And one worker got up and said, we must go out on strike and we must never go back to work. We'll stay out on strike until the system collapses. Okay? And Tambo said to him, look, he said, when you plow the field, you plow it acre by acre. You go step by step. And you've got to think, if you stay out forever, well, how are you going to live? Where's the money going to come from? So you have to think about it strategically and tactically. So you can have a long-term vision, which is the removal of apartheid, but to get that you may have to do organizing on the ground in a quite a routine kind of way. So and that to me is you have a utopian vision, but you're actually being realistic about it. You've got to combine the two. That's what I'm saying. Okay? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, because I don't believe that utopia can be something that you can take forward. But if you're saying as this reworked version, then I believe that it is workable.
Real utopia. Okay.
Any more questions? We're a room full of intellectuals.
Organic intellectuals.
When you started organizing in the 1970s,
Yeah.
Was there a sense of politics or was it purely unionism?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I think that if you tried to organize workers in the 1970s in an openly political way, the apartheid state would have crushed the organization. So the argument was that one should try and build up trade union organization in the factory and focus around wages and work conditions. And when you are sufficiently strong and well organized, one could broaden it and start to move beyond the factory to raise political issues. And that's more or less what happened, because when the rent boycotts broke out, and then the school boycotts, and the South African Defence Force went into the townships, and you had the emergence of the general strike, the stay away. The stay away in Cape Town, in Durban, in Johannesburg, and that was the beginnings of a politics. So if you like, the politics emerged, but it came from below, from workers saying, look, you can't focus only on the wages and work conditions. We've got to think about the fact that in the township we don't have proper schools, we don't have proper hospitals, we've got to attend to housing. Those issues meant that the unions had to move beyond the workplace and start to take up issues of a more political kind. And that's, of course, when the apartheid government came down and banned and arrested trade union leaders. But I think, so the union movement, my view would be that when they were organizing dock workers, people had an idea that you had to be tactically, and people, it sort of led to this debate between the workerists and the populists, where some trade unionists argued that one must focus only on the workplace, and others said one should actually link up with the ANC or link up with community organizations and organize it. I think what interests me, and there's a question that's come through here from online, which is whether one could actually rebuild that kind of movement in the now today. Well, that's a very interesting question, because I think what's happening at the moment is, and that's why I said I started off by saying, you know, when you're uncertain and you lose your way, you need to go back to where you started. You retrace your steps. And I think that what people are I think, beginning to see here is a re-emergence of militancy. The highest, just to give you a figure, the highest strike rate in South Africa during the apartheid period was in 1988. And there were 9 million man days lost. That's how you measure the strike. Last year, there were 16.5 million man days lost. In other words, almost double the number of strikes in 2011 than there were in 1988. And I think you're beginning to see, because of the economic crisis, people are feeling the squeeze, that the wages are not increasingly sufficiently to meet the rise in electricity costs, for example, the rise in petrol costs, okay, the school fees. And I think what you're beginning to see is, like we happened in Durban in 1973, I think that workers just spontaneously sometimes react against these things and come together. But they're not only doing it in the factories. We've seen these protests, what people call service delivery protests, about electricity, about water, basic things to do with daily life. And they are starting to it's almost like a rebellion of the poor that's taking place all over South Africa. And I think that that opens, and my answer to the question really about, I think that you may begin to see joint action taking place, and that kind of link between the unions and the community organizations beginning to emerge, although at the moment it's much more kind of uncoordinated, unorganized. Yeah. Yeah, Meneer.
Sorry, could we maybe take 2 or 3 questions?
Okay, fine.
Okay. Thanks, Professor Webster. My main question is this: did you, when you were building when the unions were being built, did you regard, what was your way that you related to the mainstream press? Okay, and what I mean by that is, did you ever regard, let's say, white South Africa or middle class South Africa as a relevant constituency? Like, did the unions care how they were spoken about in the mainstream or the so-called mainstream press? And did it affect your activities at all? Okay, that's my one question. Can I slip in one more? Okay. My second question is, okay, you've told us about Rick Turner and the intellectuals in Durban. But I just want to know if is there any other reason that this happened in Durban in particular, besides for the human element? Was there any objective reason? So it's about the press and the middle classes, and then about Durban. Thank you.
Okay.
We've got, I saw a hand go up in that corner and then this corner.
My question is, Professor, I read about the stuff of labor movements, but what interests me is that they keep fighting, although they don't get the answer they expect. For example, they will strike for 6 days, but after that, the bosses will just stress. So it is cause of this one. Not translated on it. It is a guy. We have a quarter. No name ends up being unite like back but still strikes to like Papil Bamba and like no name ends up being united like some ex for me.
Okay. Just tell me what's
what made them, what kept that momentum of them being united while they were, whenever they protested, they
Okay.
get fired? Why, how did they maintain that
Okay, good question.
unity?
So my question has to do with
what I'm reading in your analysis is an emphasis on agency, on strategy, on ideas, etc.
Yeah.
And I hear very little about structure. I don't hear the word class. I don't hear much about economic interests or about changes in the South African economy in the 1970s. I'm just curious as to whether that's how deliberate that choice is and what's behind it.
Good. Okay, those are excellent questions. Let me start off with the question about the press. Look, organizing black workers into trade unions in the 1970s was defined as communism, okay? And there was, on the statute book, there's a Suppression of Communism Act. And the Suppression of Communism Act had a very broad definition of communism, which was any radical change. So I think the attitude of white society generally was that that intellectuals like myself who were trying to develop trade unions were communists, and they should be banned or restricted. But I think that this is an interesting strategic point. I think that any ruling class has different interests, okay? And I think that the argument we made, and I'll come to your point about the press, the argument we made is quite simply this, that if there's going to be conflict, which there inevitably will be, between capital and labour, it's better to have that conflict regulated than unregulated. It's better to have leaders that you can negotiate with, okay? Now, you would say, well, that's a reformist argument. But it's actually, what you're doing is you're actually winning space for workers in the heart of the capitalist system. It's a kind of, that Greek analogy of getting behind the enemy's lines.
Trojan horse.
Trojan horse. This is maybe for organic intellectuals, this is something, Trojan horse. It's a wonderful idea from Greek methodology that you get behind the enemy's lines, that you subvert from within. You get behind the enemy's lines, the Trojan horse. So yes, we did, and gradually I think there were sections of capital that began to argue, yes, if we're going to have trade unions, it's better that they are inside the tent than outside the tent. It's better to have them regulated and registered. Fine, we take that on. And our argument was, yes, we need that space, win that space, get them recognized, and you gradually build up your power. So that was the idea. Okay. I mean, there are all sorts of debates around whether you register or not, bureaucratization, so on and so forth, and co-option. But I think the idea was, so we took the media quite seriously, and one of the first things we set up was a journal of our own called the South African Labour Bulletin, which still continues today. And in fact, we debated originally whether we shouldn't have it in Zulu and in English, by the way. But we ended up just having it in English. So, and we would use the press, and there was the publications board banned articles because they saw them as subversive. They could see what we were doing. We tried to influence ideas. And eventually, of course, the Vihan Commission did recognize union and took that argument. But I don't know if that answers your question. So I think it's very important to recognize that any ruling class has different interests and divisions that you can possibly exploit. Look, why Durban? Okay, now I think the question at the back about agency is I think I have focused around strategies, agency. I think you're absolutely right. But I understand, underlying my argument is that there are certain structural forces at play here. And quite simply put, why it happened in Durban, I think, is because after the crushing of the popular movement and the ANC and Sharpeville and Lange in 1960, you had a period of relative stability in South Africa, okay? Foreign capital came in a major way in South Africa, high profit rates, and created large-scale industry, large-scale factories. And that was the material base, the structural base of a new kind of unionism, where you bring together workers in large numbers, it's easier to organize, it's collective, and I think that's, so my argument would be that what you had in Durban's more of a working class city, by the way, than Cape Town, because I think you've got the factories, the big textile factories, big textile mills, and they were all right on top of each other, textile mills. And so when one group of workers went out, they would march down the streets and they would pick up other workers, and the other workers would come out. So you had this concentrated, large-scale production that brought collectively workers together, and that was the basis of it. And they were going on the trains and they would talk to each other. So you had these large, like Umlazi and KwaMashu, these big working class towns, and I think that, so you had that collective power, but it happened in February. And the reason why it happened in February is because inflation had risen at a higher rate, and people, when February and January, you're buying clothes, school uniform for the children, paying school fees, and people had that squeeze financially, and they just stopped work. And so I think that there is a set of influences there. You had also these intellectual forces. As I said, you had the Black Consciousness movement, you had these other intellectuals coming from more Marxist perspective. I think that all came together. But it didn't stay in Durban, it spread across to Cape Town, Johannesburg, and so on. So I think there are reasons. We wrote a book on it called the Durban Strikes, which, do you have a copy of it here? Okay.
It may be gone.
Okay, yes, it's a rare piece. But basically, that was, we tried to understand that it was quite spontaneous in a way, but it was structurally based. On the comrade about unions, defeat. Okay, I think that's a very good question, because I think what you're saying is that workers go out on strike and then they end up not winning what they demanded. That's what you're saying. Okay. Look, I think that's part of what it means to be working in a capitalist society. I think that at the end of the day, you can't stay out on strike indefinitely, because you starve. Yeah, you've got. I mean, what makes you a worker is that you only have your labor to sell, right? That's what a worker is somebody who doesn't own the means of production. You don't have any other source of income. So that's the definition of capitalism. Capitalism, when you've got owners of the means of production, the factory owner, and you've got workers who sell their labor. So there is if you like, a structural limit to what you're going to have to, what it means is that you're going to have to compromise. And I think that's the difficult for a trade union, because they almost is like they whip up discontent and then they have to sit on it and compromise. You know what I mean? And they said, well, you've sold out now. The workers will say, well, you've sold us out, you've settled with the bosses. But I think that's what it means to be a trade union in a capitalist society. You're not going to take over the factories. If you do take over the factories, well, then you're not in capitalism anymore. It's a different kind of society, because you're no longer producing for profit. So I think that the question is, how do you actually, I think your question was really, how do you keep workers together when they do lose or compromise? That's your point. I think That's very, very good. You're obviously an activist. I think that these are tactical questions. I think you have to be careful that you don't. I mean, it's a difficult one because on the one hand, you're saying to workers, go out and strike, okay? On the other hand, at a certain point, you're bringing them back to work. And I think it's a tactical question. You've got to know when to advance and when to retreat, okay? And you've got to know when to settle. Because if you stay out for too long, you'll find that the workers will there'll be conflicts. There'll be conflicts. And this is why we get the violence in strikes, because your wife will say to you, but there's no food on that table, the children are not able to get their clothes and so on, and you get domestic violence or you get conflicts. And you get scabs, people who break the strike being killed and attacked. So you get violence taking place. I mean, the security strike in 2007 in Johannesburg, there were 60 people killed. 60 workers were killed in that strike. So it's a difficult decision. You have to, I think, know when to go back, when to settle. And I think that's a tactical and leadership question. And maybe the part of the answer is you have to be careful what kind of demands you make. Otherwise, you're going to get quite easily outmaneuvered by management. Okay, that's kind of part, but I think it's a very interesting question. But just on the last one about, I think I've sort of tried, I mean, I think that I have focused on agency, but I would say that
what is agency?
Okay, good question. Yeah, I have focused on what the individual can do and the choices you can make. Okay, but there's that famous quote from Karl Marx, 18th Premier: "People make their own history, but not on conditions of their own choosing." And I think underlying my approach has been a theory about how capitalism works. I haven't spelled that out in this particular talk, but I think that's quite fundamental to an argument. Yeah. Okay. Right. You want to come back on that? Hey.
Come on there.
I've got. Okay, I've got two. While you're thinking about it, I've got two questions here. They're rather difficult.
Sorry, and one more from the floor.
Okay, from the floor. Let me take the one from the
Two
floor.
more from the floor.
Okay, comrade. You take. Who's the other? Okay.
I would love to know what influence does the Cosatu have on the ruling party, on making decisions, on decision part. And second of all, does Cosatu have any chance of winning the e-tolling case?
Okay. Okay. I think that I would. For me, the relationship between Cosatu and the ANC is a bit like an unhappy marriage, right? You don't get divorced, but you actually live together, but you have constant attacks on each other and a bit of domestic violence, and you shout at each other. So I think it's a very what's the word? Turbulent, very troubled relationship. But I also think that I don't think they'll get divorced. Okay, if I can use the idea of marriage, I don't think they'll get divorced. I think that their influence is not that great, because I think that whichever government came to power in South Africa in this global context of neoliberal capitalism, I think they're going to be constrained. They're going to have to to make compromises. And, you know, people thought, well, Cosatu backed Zuma, and they thought, well, Zuma comes to power, he'll be much more friendly towards Labour than Mbeki. But of course, you know, it hasn't turned out like that. Because of the nature of global capitalism as a system, I think you're quite limited. I'm not saying you can't do things that are different. So I think at the end of the day, their influence, I wouldn't say they're marginal. I don't think they were marginal. I think there was a period in the early 90s when they were quite equal partners. But it's not an equal partnership. Okay. The question about the e-toll, I mean, that's, I'm not a Sangoma, okay? I can't make predictions. But, you know, it's one term that you could think about is the word dilemma. I mean, sometimes you're caught between two equally difficult situations. The fact of the matter is that in order to improve the roads in Gauteng, they borrowed an enormous amount of money and brought in a foreign company. Somebody has to pay back that money. Okay, so I think, this is my, I mean, this is a little bit of, I think they'll compromise, and there'll be some concessions. Cosatu will say, look, we've been consulted, and so on, but I think it'll go ahead. It'll go ahead. Because they, you know, they'll put their individual motorists will be fined and so on and so forth. So I think there are limits to that protest. Yeah. So who was the other person? Yes, sir. Yes, comrade.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Ukwazi. I'm from Social Justice Coalition. And then you spoke about Cosatu was financially stable at that time. So, as a new generation, we don't know much about that. I would like to know where did you see ANC and Cosatu corruption thing started? Because immediately when we talk of corruption, when we think of ANC, most of the time people think of corruption. You see. So I would like to hear your views about that, and the fact that ANC is one of the parties that has leadership. They have the most leaders in ANC. And even at that time, they had more leaders. Because you mentioned that they used to have faith on their leaders. They stand by their leaders. They believe in their leaders. Their leaders have to account for them.
Accountable, yeah.
Yes. And even today, our leaders are able to stand at ANC. You see, they are able to stand in front. They are able to speak, to influence the community. And I think most youth today, they still believe in ANC. You see, they don't see other part. But I'm not a politician, but I would like to hear your views on that, on corruption and on leadership on ANC. Are the leaders of today or the same as those ones? And do you think the faith that they had on those years is the faith that we can restore in this new generation?
Okay. Sure. Okay.
Should we take it the back there and then me?
Yeah, I also would like to raise a question. I'm Kashifa. I would like to know, seeing that we're talking about all this politics and that, and I know we in the working class and we're the ones that's really struggling out here. And I have a different view, like my comrade is saying about people that still faith in the ANC. Yes, there's still people that are loyalists to the ANC, but I believe there's still people that don't have faith in the ANC. Yes, we belong to Cosatu, and SACP is also there. Do you think there will be a breakaway from the ANC, Cosatu and the SACP, and form their own party?
Okay, can I just try? These are difficult questions here. I just wanted to. I wanted to. If I could just. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a teacher, so I do these things. The argument I was making is that in 1973 you had strikes, mass strikes, okay, and out of that you had a workers' movement emerged. At the same time, you had the ANC, which was a powerful, going back to 1912. Okay, so you had these two traditions here, and they came together in a way in Cosatu. Cosatu was a kind of strategic compromise. That's the word. It was a kind of strategic compromise between these two, what I call narratives, two traditions. And the question about leadership, I think the trade union tradition is a much more shop floor, direct, accountable. You know, you elect a worker, and that worker speaks on your behalf. That worker doesn't go off to Cape Town and represent you in Parliament. Okay? Do you know what I mean? There's a difference. There's a different kind of democracy. The one is a direct democracy. You can see we elect you as the shop steward, and if we see you talking to the boss on your own, we know you're an impimpi, right? Okay? So, but if you elect somebody for Parliament, they come down and you don't know what they're going to do here in Cape Town, right? And what deals they'll get up to. Okay? So I think that there are actually different ways of understanding democracy. I think that what I was trying to capture in this workers' movement was the idea of direct democracy as against a more indirect form. Now, the question about, and they're different kind of leaders. I mean, a shop steward is usually an ordinary worker who has the confidence of his fellow workers. A politician in the ANC is usually somebody who has got some kind of education and networks, and it's a different kind of leadership. The question about corruption. I mean, I don't. I don't think there is corruption in Cosatu, because they also have tenders that they and they sit on. They have these union investment companies, but I don't think it's on any. I wouldn't see that as a major issue. Or whether leaders could re-emerge. I suppose what I was suggesting is that the conditions that we are now facing and the uncertainty is also an opportunity for a new generation to develop a new vision and a disciplined approach. So I think that is a possibility, although I think generally the protests haven't really generated a clear kind of organization. Now there was a second, what was the second? Oh, about the alliance, was it? About the Workers' Party? Look, yeah, you're putting me on the spot here a bit. I think that if, you know, we've been doing surveys of Cosatu members now since 1994, and if I say, we go into the factories and we ask questions about the ANC and so on, and roughly speaking, about 70% support the ANC. But there are two things that are important. Firstly, there are regional variations. So you'll find here in the Western Cape, there are trade union workers who won't necessarily support the ANC, and you'll find in Durban there's some who support the IFP, for example. But and secondly, there's been a steady decline, not a dramatic decline, but a steady decline in support amongst workers for the ANC, but not a dramatic. So I would agree with you when you say that most workers support the ANC, and I don't think that the idea of, I think that maybe down the road there will be a separate political party, but I'd be surprised if it happens in the next 5-10 years. That's my view about that. I think that the ANC is the party of liberation, and it's still seen as that by most workers. Yeah. Sorry, what was the other question? Have I answered the questions?
Yeah.
I have some questions that have come through, so I can quickly answer these. Is the recent labour broking e-toll protest a Durban 1973 moment? That's interesting. Well, there was the big protest on the 15th of March, or was it, or 15th of April? 15th of March? March. You know what was different about those protests is that they were on the streets. They weren't people staying at home. They were marching in the streets. And I think that's a significant difference. I don't think, I think that the Durban moment was different. It was a period when there was an illegitimate state, a racist apartheid state. I think it's different now. I think we have a democratic state. It's been elected by the people. I wouldn't have seen it as the same. And what are your views on Cosatu leaving the alliance? Okay, I think we've answered that one. I don't think that's going to happen in the short term. No. Yeah.
Sure, even me? Okay. I just want to say thank you very much to Eddie. Yeah. Comrade Eddie, not Professor. Comrade Professor.
Okay, yeah.
I have a very different, not a different perspective, I have a Cape Town perspective on a lot of...
Depends which side of the mountain you stand.
Exactly. So I stand from the Cape Town side of the mountain of the struggle. And I grew up, and one of the first people who taught me about trade unionism was a woman called Zora Mehlamakulu. And she, in 1972, was part of a group of SACP unionists who went to Wages Commission leaders, to Paula Ensor, to Rob Peterson, and other people like that, and said, will you help us? And they helped build first the Western Province Workers' Advice Bureau, and then later it became the General Workers Union, then became the Transport and General Workers Union, and then it became SATAU. And it was only when it became SATAU that workers were killed on a large scale, but not before. But to take a step back, as Eddie mentioned, one of the important things of leaders in that time was that in 1976 there was a worker called Luke Mazwembe, Story Mazwembe, and he was killed in detention. He was a dock worker here, tortured and killed for being part of the labor movement. Similarly, in Johannesburg, in 1982, Neil Agate, a doctor, a young white doctor who joined the trade unions, the Food and Canning Workers Union, and Neil was killed in detention, or tortured so much that he killed himself. And I remember in 1982, all the trade unions calling for a stoppage in the factories. And at that time, it was the largest stoppage of workers in factories. So this is the history that all of us must go back and learn. Because all we hear of in history now is MK and its few bombs, which actually didn't bring us anything apart from a few mad veterans. But what we did have are worker leaders and community leaders that really built the ANC, built the labor movement, built the UDF. And their stories are not being told. And unless we have people like Eddie who tell us about these things. Now, I want to ask Eddie a very difficult question. And I hope I can get an answer. Today's union movement is not yesterday's union And I believe that our union movement looks back to the 18th and 19th century. It is still male-dominated. It doesn't have a view of the unemployed and casual workers that allows for unity. Its understanding of the global economy appears to be very limited, limited only to the ILO and so on, as opposed to massive joint campaigns by workers. So, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that unions have invested huge amounts of money in pension funds and elsewhere, and also that the unions are in alliance with government. And at the same time, without Cosatu, our freedom in the country would be severely undermined, because the labor movement has been indispensable, whether it was in tax struggle for ARVs, whether it is in the struggle against the secrecy bill and so on. So I want to ask you, what sort of vision do you have for a modern 21st century labor movement in a world where unemployment and environmental danger and rampant and lawless capital at global level exists? What's your vision for a labor movement?
Sure.
I want to explore, you made a point that Cosatu embodied the Congress and the trade union tradition. Now, I want to know what actually that meant. I mean, so the trade union tradition is represented by Cosatu, and the Congress tradition is represented by unions sympathetic to Congress, or was it something different? So what do you mean by Cosatu embodying both traditions? My second question was, we speak about worker leadership and accountability and democracy. But what happened post-1994 is all the union representatives who ostensibly represented Cosatu in parliament and in cabinet were effectively, essentially co-opted and never represented worker interest at political level. So what happened there? Why didn't the union have the right of recall for these union leaders who became people like Sidney Mafumadi, people like Sam Shilowa, people like Jay Naidu, effectively were co-opted?
Okay. Well, that question is in some ways easier to answer. I think that, the idea in 1994 was that because, as we've been arguing here, because the trade unions were so central to the struggle, that the next step was to go into Parliament and try and influence policy in post-apartheid South Africa. And Cosatu sent its key leadership, Connie September being one of them here, to Parliament. I think, what happened is that they rapidly became isolated from their base. But that's, when you look at it retrospectively, was inevitable, because a political party has a very tight caucus and discipline. So if you join the ANC, you've got to follow the ANC policy. And what happened is that the Cosatu guys who came to Parliament, first 94, again in 99, were drawn into the structures of the ANC, and they lost contact with their members. I think it was, it's a difficult question, because the alternative, if you say, well, they should have formed their own party, well, then you get involved in parliamentary politics.
No, but not necessarily. If they had maintained the ground rules at the very beginning, and not become co-opted,
yes,
things would have changed. But because they became co-opted, all subsequent leaders...
But I'm saying that they became co-opted was kind of inevitable, because they were subject to the discipline of the ANC then, and had to follow its line. But look, I think it could have been organized differently if they had tried to establish close links, but I think they didn't do that. So this is one of the disappointments of it. But I think that you're quite right, they did become isolated. Just if I go back to, this is a tough one. Okay, you've thrown at me here. Trade unions in the 21st century. I think that the key difference is that the trade union movement is now operating in a global economy. So when workers are producing a shirt in Newcastle, in KwaZulu-Natal, they're producing a shirt in competition with Chinese workers or Thai workers or some other workers who are operating on a much lower wage system. So I think that globalization has changed it, and I think I think the first thing for me, Zaki, would be that I think that trade unions have to think globally and internationally, and start to organize on that basis. And I think that the question about, and I think that a lot of things follow from that, because, and I think Cosatu, in fairness to Cosatu, they are actually taking up the issue of climate change in quite a systematic way, because what's happened, you know, you're commoditizing nature, you're turning, you're polluting, you are destroying the environment, and Cosatu realizes it's a very central question. It's quite difficult because, you know, if you are a mining worker and you say, well, we must stop fossil fuel coal, and that's going to affect jobs, that's quite a difficult set of choice. But I think they are grappling with it more than any other organization in the civil society mass organization, I think. But they do remain not male dominated. It's very interesting, actually. You look at the gender question. In the 1970s, there were a lot of women who were running the trade unions. As they grew in power, the men took over. It's a familiar story. Yeah. And the men started to dominate in the leadership position. So you actually have less, and we've done, you can do plenty of research to, you've got less women in leadership positions in Cosatu now than we had in the 70s. Because the men, you know, wanted the power. And on the question, look, the big problem for Labour is the casualisation and outsourcing, because it's undermining your traditional power base. Your power base lay in the factory, where you can bring production to a standstill. Now you have people in the informal economy working in the streets, working from home. It's much more difficult to organise, and that's what I would call a representational gap. I think it's fundamental. I don't think Cosatu is addressing it. I think they're addressing basically the permanent, more skilled, established workers. Rhetorically, they talk about organising them, but I think they're going to have to do that if they want a future. I agree with you that, and I think on the question of unemployment, I mean, it's very. I mean, there is a community work program, there's an expanded public work program that does provide jobs for people, and the community work program it does allow for continuous work 2 days a week, and Cosatu has supported that, but it's a drop in the ocean still on that. Yeah, there was another question. No. I wanted, actually, before I forget that, like, yeah, actually, there's a book here on trade unions and the global crisis. I thought I'd leave behind. I have a chapter in here. And also another one of my books here. Can I leave? I see you've got
You can sign.
Okay, I see you've got a library here. That's great, yeah. Sorry, okay. There was another question. Somebody, who was it? It was you.
The embodiment of Cosatu as the ANC.
Oh, the question about the compromise. Look, I think, you know, I think that, well, I'm trying to suggest that there are these two traditions, okay? And I think that, I understood the compromise to be that Cosatu would form an alliance with the ANC, accepting the ANC as the leading force in the national liberation movement, but acting independently, that Cosatu would be an independent, autonomous body. And I think that's how it was conceived. I think the problem is that by forming an alliance with the ruling party, the trade union leaders then start to think in terms of moving from the trade union into government, into either local government or provincial government or central government, or becoming cabinet ministers or so on and so forth. And I think that it acts as a kind of patronage network. And I think that maybe that's something that is a fundamental flaw. I think that it shouldn't be a stepping stone into the ANC. But Vavi, Zwelithini Vavi, says he's not going into Parliament, into government. So wait and see. I mean, maybe you're smiling, you think it's not likely to happen. Eh? It's a temptation, and I think that's a dangerous thing. I think the trade unions should stay independent from that, but they could still be in alliance and try and influence it. Yeah.
And on that note, please help me in thanking Professor Comrade Webster for this extraordinary